good to go? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Orange Stage, the first day of Event Tech Live. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a couple of housekeeping bits before we get going. The first of those is in order to get the best experience audially of the session, we recommend that you wear the headsets. After the session, if you can leave your headsets on the chair, and they'll be cleaned in between each session as well. We will be running questions during the session as well today, but we won't be doing those through the audience. We'll be doing those using Glisser. So the best way to access those is through the website, which is glsr.live/ETL21. And as I said, that's the best way to raise questions during the session. There'll also be a QR code on screen during the session. You can scan that, and that will take you to that platform in order to answer questions. We're delighted to welcome Anna here today. She's going to be running the first session for us, and the subject matter today is data dirty? Looking all about sustainability and the role that a good understanding of data can have in doing that. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Anna from Isla.
Thank you very much. Hello, great to be here and there as well. So yes, my name is Anna. I am the co-founder of Isla, which is the industry sustainability body that was established in 2020 to essentially transform the events industry and provide the action and response and resource that we need to tackle the climate crisis and take part in that global ambition. So I'm going to be talking today on the question of whether or not data is dirty. So if we just get a little bit of context going about what we mean when we talk about dirty data, what is happening today, where are we, why are we having this conversation? And essentially it is crunch time. So as we are here today live from the Truman Brewery, but also joining virtually online, COP26 is taking place and it's tackling the single biggest issue that humanity has had to face, which is the climate crisis. And just a little bit of context, greater context in that space is that, you know, we talk about the pandemic and talk about Brexit and our recovery from these and the way that we manage them, but these are entirely eclipsed and are intrinsically bound up in how we address the climate change, climate crisis. So what is the global climate ambition that we're working towards? The long and short of it is a 1.5 degree future. That is the global climate ambition, and that is what people are gathered to talk about over the next couple of weeks in COP. So we essentially have one shot to limit global warming to a rise of 1.5 degrees to ensure that our species, that's humanity, but also millions of other species can survive the next century and the ones coming, which means that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next 8 years. So what trajectory are we on? Are we heading towards 1.5? The short answer is no, we are not on track. That is the reality. We're on track for somewhere between 3 to 6 degrees century, so by 2100. 4 is kind of the agreed average. I very much plan to be around in 2100. I'm not sure I want to be around if it's 4 degrees warmer, despite the fact that actually today in London it's pretty cold. But the question then is, what role does data have to play in shaping our future? Which brings us back to the question, is data dirty? So we should probably talk about what we mean by that. What is dirty data? Well, we've got data that you could consider as morally dirty, how we're exploiting it and mining it from people. We've got environmentally dirty data, so the actual climate impact. And then there's essentially, you know, just bad data that skews your research, skews your output, skews your understanding and your metrics, those sorts of things. So if we put that in the context of people, planet and purpose, you might have heard of the triple bottom line, which is about people, planet and profit. We want to reframe that profit narrative to the one about purpose, because good business today is purposeful business. It's not just profit driven. So we've got people, planet, purpose, and we've got that kind of idea about morally dirty data, environmentally dirty data, and then just general dirty data that you can't use because it's been collected and managed badly. So this chart shows that between 27 and 2019, 90% of the world's existing data was collected. So enormous quantities. You can see the huge kind of, it's essentially exponential growth at the moment. So compared to 2020, where we collected, I think, around 65 zettabytes, and I don't actually really know how much that is, it's just a fictional number for most of us, it is set to treble in the next 5 years. So how do we contextualize that all within that people, planet, purpose space? Well, coming on to people, let's look at that kind of what is morally dirty. So we've got exploitation issues, social justice issues, and security issues. So we are mined for our data, and it's used to shape the way that companies target us through advertising, essentially. And that fuels capitalism and the pursuit of limitless growth, which is ultimately destroying our planet. And that's actually what's being talked about today at COP26. It's kind of a finance day. How do we reshape our economies? How do we reshape our finances to stop us kind of going on this limitless growth trajectory and burning our house down? And all of this is tied into so many different issues like social justice and security and the more insidious ways that data is obtained about us. So I think it was announced yesterday that Facebook, or Meta, however you want to call them these days, are shuttering their facial recognition system because the regulation of that kind of technology is currently up for debate. And ultimately that's because it's intrinsically bound up in the narrative of how data is exploited for corporate gains, how it impacts on marginalised communities, how it's used for policing, warfare, and so on. You know, the moral issues around data collection and data mining are enormous. Of the personal data that is actually available to collect about you, so that might be your email address or your date of birth, it's your face, your photo library on your phone, your step count, any biomedical information that you plug into your iPhone or your Pixel. Facebook actually collects about 75% of data that it can. And in 2021, the top two companies collecting the most available data were Facebook and Instagram at 75% and 69%. And there are others holding top spots like Uber and Strava and Tinder and so on. But Facebook are collecting, Meta are collecting vast volumes of data about us, and they're also bound up in the news on a daily basis about the exploitation of that. So that's what we talk about when we talk about morally dirty data. So then when it comes on to the conversation about planet, really we're talking about the impacts of data storage. So we've got huge processes that are really energy intensive and storage intensive, like Bitcoin, and then we've got things like wasted data, duplicated data, and then where that's actually all going and what we're doing with it. So we take unlimited storage for granted today. Back, when I was a teenager, a while ago now, but back in the days of like the Nokia 3210s and 3310s, you were limited to 10 text messages being stored on your phone. And so they became prized messages. And as a teen, it would be, the one I'd get from a crush or the funny one that my best mate would have sent me that I wanted to store. But essentially, those messages had posterity. You carefully filtered what you did and didn't want to keep. And really, it was about, that lack of unlimited storage made what you did have precious. Whereas now, the average person takes about 900 photos a year. Most of them are rubbish and unwanted and don't look at them again. And you just can't be bothered to delete them because it takes loads of energy to go through and delete them. I am guilty of this. I have 5,000 photos stored on my phone. Most of them are rubbish and I don't like to look at them. And they are also synced with the cloud. So not only are they stored physically on my phone, they're stored in a cloud somewhere. And I don't know how to unsync them, basically. I don't want them on the cloud. I don't want them on the internet. I know they're rubbish. I know they're crap, but I can't figure out how to get myself out of that mess. So that's a real issue. But all of this stuff is going somewhere. All of that data that's being stored is existing in a space. So just to give a little bit of a stat about that, with the average person taking about 900 photos per year, it accumulates to around 10 kilos of carbon emissions annually for every adult in the UK. It basically equates to around 100,000 flights to Australia. So it's a huge, huge amount of carbon associated with the storage of what is essentially crap. So let's just dig a little bit deeper on that emissions space to really contextualize it and why it's so important for that 1.5 degree future. Tech accounts for around 3.7% of global greenhouse emissions, and this is set to double in the next few years. So that's our gadgets and the internet and the systems that exist to support that. So it's a huge amount. And if we just put that in context, the aviation industry is responsible for around 2.5% and food waste for about 5%. So this really does show the genuine impact of tech and data storage on the climate. Just a little bit more in that space. The average number of emails sent per day based on emails you need to send, spam emails that you get, and emails that you're copied into that you don't need to really be part of, it equates to around half a ton of carbon, well, over half a ton of carbon per year per person in the UK. The annual total footprint of somebody in India is around 1.5 tons per year. So that's just your inbox. That doesn't account for the data that's stored for your online shopping or your banking or your search engines or web pages, the ads you see on those. The list of what we're accessing from a data perspective is endless. So that's just from our emails. And then lastly, data centers account for around 2% of global greenhouse emissions. So within that 3.7%, the actual data centers where the processing and the storage is happening is almost the equivalent of the global aviation industry. So it's kind of a question of, do I swap my holiday this year for the data that I'm storing? It's kind of the question that we can ask ourselves if we're looking at how to reduce our carbon emissions. It's all got to go somewhere, and it's got to go into the cloud. And the cloud isn't tangible. It's, you know, it's like that chocolate bar in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that filters over your head. You think it's floating somewhere, and it's because we don't really have the real comprehension about where it exists. It does exist in a physical space. It's just marketed to us that it exists in this fictional ether. So we often forget about that. So if we just come back to this chart, we can see that our data storage requirements are growing, and they're estimated to triple between now and 2025, and that's going to have a doubling in our carbon emissions. So we're anticipating that by 2025, data and the internet and the systems that we use are going to account for around 8 to 10% of global emissions, and we have to be driving emissions down, not letting them go up. That's, you know, non-negotiable. So kind of there are some really good things happening in the space. There are some bad things as well. So there's been some really great advances in the way that tech is located and designed, that where our data centers are built and how they're designed. So for example, Google has used, you know, AI to reduce the cooling costs of their facilities by about 40%. Through efficiencies, which is amazing. Amazon uses in some of its spaces recycled water for cooling, so it's not drawing from freshwater systems. Microsoft are building their underwater data centers, and a lot of the big tech have moved to Scandinavia, where it's cooler. You don't need to pay as much AC to keep everything cool. So there's some really great moves in that. But then we have things like backup and resiliency. When they go down, when these server farms go down, when the data centers go down, they're knocking onto diesel energy to power them. And despite all of that, even if we're looking at entirely renewable spaces and entirely renewable power, we're still just building more data centers, which requires energy. It requires mining of resources, of materials, concrete, steel, copper, wiring, all these sorts of things. So there's still an issue. Just because we're going renewable in those spaces doesn't necessarily mean that there's no carbon emissions associated with it. So on a planetary level, we are collecting, storing and wasting data, and our actions are having huge ramifications in that space, which ultimately leads us on to the point about purpose and purposeful data, because we can't live without data. That's just not the way our society is set up to function. So how do we talk about it? Why are we collecting it? What are we doing with it? So there's two kind of angles here, which is about bad data use. So the corrupt application of the data that we're getting. So it impacts our political systems. So if you think about the way that Cambridge Analytica had such huge impacts on Brexit and US elections, that's a real kind of corrupt application of data that's collected about us. It influences the way we consume our media. So algorithms that keep us trapped in echo chambers. There are issues like shadow banning of fringe social movement groups on social media. Like, you know, it's applied badly. The data we're collecting is applied badly. There are security breaches. So, for example, in March this year, Microsoft had a breach that exposed over 30,000 businesses. And then things like identity theft, which affect you on a very personal level, might be something we've all been victim to. I had an Argos card set up in my name, and I spent £169 on an Xbox. So I didn't even get the benefits of that, unfortunately. But these are kind of corrupt applications of data that is collected and processed about us. This all sounds awful. What are we doing? We're living in this technological society. We think tech is better for the planet. We think digital is better for the planet. Actually, we're recognizing that there are some of these issues here, but also there is the good side of data. I'm not all doom and gloom. I'm actually quite fun and quite a positive, upbeat person. But there are things like data visualization. So data is incredibly powerful. We think in pictures. We don't think in pictures, we communicate in pictures. I mean, if you go way back before we had writing and before we had real, what we think of as real language and communication, cave pictures. That's how we communicated. We are very, very, very visual people. So that data visualization enables us to highlight issues, and that supports systems transformation. So if we're using data properly, if we're using it purposefully, we can do some incredible things. So forget, for the time being, using it solely to increase sales or improve marketing, which is kind of the number one reason that as businesses we collect information in the corporate space. Data is so powerful because it brings information to life. Data visualization is so powerful because it brings information to life. It makes you the storyteller of the insights that are basically hidden within those numbers that you're collecting. So without the collection and collation of data, we wouldn't, for example, have been able to track like trends and hotspots in COVID-19, for example, and respond accordingly and change the way that we lock down our tiering systems. Whether or not we feel that it actually worked in the UK is a different matter, but we were using data for a purpose, and that was for a public health and social good purpose. Also, without data collection and that data visualization process, we would not have an accurate picture of the climate change trajectory that we are on. We wouldn't be able to understand and model different approaches, different reduction pathways. The right collection and application of data enables us to highlight massive issues, to model alternative approaches, and support system transformation, basically. And if there is one thing that we desperately, desperately need right now, it is systems transformation, and that is what the conversation is about at COP. So why is this relevant to events? Why are we talking about this in an events context? Well, as we said, leaders, activists, NGOs, brands, faith leaders, individuals are all gathered in Glasgow to push forward those commitments and actions to create that 1.5 degree future. And that was why ILA was established, essentially. We were established to transform the events industry in line with that future. And we believe in the power of purposeful data to do that. So we essentially said, how can we, as an industry, support that global ambition of a 1.5 degree future? How can we use tech to do that? How can we use data to do that? And how can we use data to transform it? And so we have actually created Trace, which is a real-time carbon reporting tool for events. It's basically designed to help event owners, planners, businesses accurately measure the impact of your events from an environmental perspective, so that we can create transformation in those individual spaces for those individual businesses, but also for the industry on a whole. And I'll come on to that in a moment, but essentially that data collected is anonymously aggregated back end so that we can get a full industry insight, which is really, really exciting, and I'll come on to that. So Trace basically measures the full scope of your event deliveries, so it captures carbon and waste impacts across catering, trucking, travel, attendee travel, accommodation, materials, graphics, energy, waste, all those sorts of things. You're able to estimate and compare the different approaches that you might want to take. So you can estimate, if I was to have 100 beef dishes compared to 100 plant-based dishes, what would be my carbon emission savings in that space. It enables you to then go ahead and accurately measure your event emissions once you have completed your event and collected all that information, and then analyze your performance immediately. So it does this in real time. You input your data and you get a really beautiful dashboard that helps you understand and visualizes that data for you. And so it means you don't have to rely on a third-party carbon consultancy. You can do it in-house, you do it within your team, and it's basically about kind of climate literacy for event professionals, In the same way that if you build a budget, you start being able to chunk out, well, I'll need to allocate X amount to staff time and I'll need to allocate X amount to catering. You start to understand how to talk, event planning in numbers in that way. And Trace enables you to do that because you can start event planning in carbon. And so it's a really, really useful tool. And then essentially it helps you to report in line with global standards. So it reports in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Science-Based Targets Initiative, Race to Zero. It counts across your scope 1, 2 and 3 carbon. If you know anything about that, then that's a good thing. If you don't, then it's a good thing. But essentially it enables you to align with that global ambition of a 1.5 degree pathway. So it's all about data visualization and making that data accessible, because that's a big thing that's missing at the moment when it comes to event carbon reporting, is being able to understand what you're doing. So Trace is designed around easy information. It's really accessible, it's really clear, it's really intuitive, but the key thing here is about that visualization piece, to understand this is my carbon footprint for this event, whether it's in person or virtual, per person carbon emissions, understanding where the big impacts are, and actually inbuilt within the tool are reduction suggestions on how you can actually reduce your carbon footprint through different choices. So again, it's that education piece. And that's where the real power sits with something like Trace and using data purposefully, is that we can do so much with knowledge. So sustainability is a really complex global issue. It is not an individual problem, and it's not a single company problem. This is something that we have to collaborate on, and that's why we've got over 140 nation states at COP having this conversation, because we have to collaborate and find a way to work together. And Trace essentially does that. So it contributes to that transformative change that we need, because all of the data that's input into that tool is anonymized and aggregated back end to basically contribute to the ILA industry reporting initiative. And that reporting initiative is to measure the events industry, to really understand the impact that it has, the footprint, so that we can build that picture and use that data to set ambitions and to set targets and review our year-on-year performance against this. So it will enable us to visualize and track our trajectory and model reduction pathways in line with global ambitions. So all of that data as well enables ILA as an organisation, which is designed to help this transformation, to develop resources, projects, infrastructure improvements, to innovate, to look at solutions, and to create basically a positive feedback loop of action that's going to drive change that we need across the sector. So you can find out more at traceyour.events about the tool. It's releasing later this month to our members, our ILA members, and then more broadly in January to the rest of the industry. But really this is all about starting to look at purposeful data collection to transform the way that we deliver our events for people and planet. And that brings me to the end. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if we've got any questions come through, but yeah, happy to partake. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. That was amazing. It's such an on-topic conversation, so thank you. We have got a few questions, so I was just going to take them in kind of a bit of an order that makes a bit of sense to me, if that's all right. So the first of those was just from early on in your presentation. Could you explain further what specifically makes up the carbon footprint of a photo or an email?
So essentially it comes down to that storage piece, that if you're just storing it on your phone, it's stored as the data storage that you have. That's in a physical space that you own. That requires charging and those sorts of things. But if you're syncing with a cloud platform, which happens most of the time with a lot of our data, it's going to a facility where it is essentially stored. So that's what creates the carbon footprint. So it's the energy used to power that data center. And then if you kind of take a step back, it's the building and growth of that data center in the first place.
Amazing, thank you. Next, I'll take the top one. So how would you suggest that we, as individuals, can reduce our tech carbon footprint? Examples given are reducing our data storage online, or what can we do?
Really, really tedious stuff. So like unsubscribe from newsletters, go through your email inbox and delete it. Don't send an email that says thanks. If it's less than like 5 words, don't send that email. Assume that people are polite and they're grateful for that information. Don't send unnecessary attachments via email if you don't need to. You know, don't take hundreds of photos and sync them in the cloud, go through your cloud. I mean, it's really boring stuff. In order to reduce our footprint, we just have to go and sit down for half a day. I mean, I have emails from my friends when I first set up my email address when I was 14 that I don't want to get rid of because they're memories, but I also have hundreds of emails from, I think, money saving expert that I've never opened. So I need to go through and just do that. So I've started unsubscribing myself.
Amazing, thank you. Brilliant advice. And the final question really was about the sustainability agenda, sort of more generally. So, how have you found kind of people's interaction with the sustainability agenda changed since you started Isla? And do you think the events industry is doing enough to take this problem of sustainability seriously?
We have had an amazing response since we founded Isla. The conversation, when we started the conversation in 2019 with our founding member agencies, there was definitely appetite in that space. But I think it was a kind of, we don't know what to do, we don't really know how big an issue this is, and you know, we're not sure how to respond to it. And ultimately, the recognition was that people across the industry were desperate for somewhere to go and to be able to ask questions and what solutions were there, and there was just nowhere to turn. So with the kind of establishment of Isla and our focus as being really action driven, so it's not just about saying there's a problem, but how do we respond to that problem? You know, I think there's been a massive shift in attitude and narrative, and you know, that's not solely us. I think we've played a part in that, but you know, there's massive. The pandemic was, it put the kind of right time, right place, because people were suddenly able to see how shifts in lifestyle and behavioural patterns did have direct impact on the climate, and I think that just helped push the narrative even further about how important it is. And then with the build up to COP, like, you know, it's been an amazing time for us. We've grown massively, and the events sector is beginning to take serious steps towards addressing the challenges. But we are behind. We are an industry that is behind. We're behind aviation, we're behind finance, we're behind tech, we're behind auto, because we're hidden behind those industries. We're at the intersection of those. You know, we support them and facilitate them. We are not that front-facing industry, and so it's been a lot easier for us to maybe ignore the problem or not know how to respond to it because we pass it on to our clients. It's not us. And so, but there has been a real shift in that, and there's been so much work, things like One Industry, One Voice, and we make experiences and we create events that, you know, all of those different campaigns were looking at how we can create the industry to have its own representation as well. And so there is definitely a shift. But it's a journey, and I was having this conversation just beforehand that it's not going to change overnight. And that's the same across the globe. People look like they're making big strides, and there are being big strides and big commitments and ambitions, but it's the action piece that we really have to follow through with, and that's the thing that takes time. But with lots of people taking action, organisations like ours driving changes and infrastructure improvements and resource development and all these kinds of things, that's what's going to facilitate that. So yeah, I think that answers the question.
Very thoroughly, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our questions and to the end of the first session on the Orange stage at Event Tech Live today. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to Anna Abdelnour from Isla for an amazing presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.